Montana, 1968. Eleanor Whitmore, a 54-year-old woman who had lost her husband 2 years earlier, stood alone on the slope of Bear Ridge, a place notorious for winter wind speeds, reaching 42-60 miles per hour, where the wind didn't just blow but tested the limits of anyone daring enough to stay. She lingered for a long time on the edge of the slope, observing the wind direction, the gradient, the distribution of rocks at the base, all the factors that would determine whether a cabin could stand firm there or not. While examining the hard soil polished smooth by the wind, a gray stray dog quietly emerged from the natural wind corridor, the very feature that had driven away many animals but forged the strongest survivors. It limped, but its eyes were alert, watching her every move. It didn't bark, didn't beg for food, just stood there like a creature that understood the price of a Montana winter. When Eleanor walked, it followed. When she stopped, it stopped. The bond between them didn't come from petting or affection, but from the instinct of two beings who both knew that to survive atop Bear Ridge, sometimes you needed one thing that wouldn't abandon you in the mountain wind. And the narration rang out, as if speaking for the land itself. Sometimes fate arrives as the one thing that won't abandon you beneath the mountain wind. The town of Hawkstone always prided itself on understanding Bear Ridge better than any outsider, for after nearly a century enduring Montana's brutal winters, they had memorized the laws of this land, the narrow canyons that created a Venturi effect, multiplying wind speed by 1.5 as it passed through natural corridors, where even a small design mistake in a cabin could send the entire roof flying in a single night. So when word spread that Eleanor Whitmore, a 54-year-old widow from out of state, had bought land right on the slope of Bear Ridge to build a cabin by herself, the whole town immediately saw it as a joke that needed no punchline. Norman Pike, owner of the lumberyard, who knew the load limits of every type of young pine, just waved his hand. Side winds at 50 miles an hour are enough to snap the wood she bought in half. If that cabin lasts 2 weeks, I'll change my name. Earl Mason at the gas station recalled the 1,957 story of a family who lost their entire cabin to snow load, reaching 40-60 pounds per square foot, the roof collapsing in just hours. He shook his head, saying one early season snowfall would finish off that widow. And Walter Briggs, the oldest farmer who had lived through more winters than anyone in the area, delivered a short but final verdict. That spot's only for the young, the strong, and those with a crew. She's got none of the three. From the cafe to the general store, Hawkstone quickly turned Eleanor into a symbol of certain failure. An older woman, alone, choosing the toughest plot in the region, hiring no workers, having no man to help, and seemingly knowing nothing about Montana's climate. But what the town didn't know was that Eleanor didn't see nature as an enemy to fight. She observed the wind patterns, read her late husband's old notes, studied classic frontier cabin structures, and memorized the physics principles that most mountain folk ignored. While most in Hawkstone believed survival depended on brute strength, Eleanor believed it depended on understanding, and she wasn't building a cabin to challenge Bear Ridge. She was building one to adapt to it. Eleanor began work in the early days of fall, when the ground was still soft enough to dig and the Bear Ridge winds hadn't yet reached dangerous speeds. She didn't build by intuition or emotion, but based on the simple physics principles her husband had written in his notebook notes she had read and memorized over the past 2 years as a way to keep him close. The first step was the stone foundation. Eleanor chose large slabs heavy enough to create thermal mass, retaining heat better than wood and reducing heat loss into the ground. She laid the stones in an interlocking pattern to resist frost heaving when the soil freezes and expands, then contracts upon thawing, which could shift an entire foundation if it lacked sufficient mass and bonding. That stone base also lowered the cabin's center of gravity, reducing sway in gusts. Next came the timber frame. Eleanor avoided nails, knowing that in strong crosswinds, nails became weak points. Wood expands and contracts with moisture and temperature, while nails do not, causing joints to separate. Instead, she used mortise and tenon joints, an old technique carpenters in the 19th century relied on when metal was scarce. These joints handle twisting and compression well, and are especially effective against low-frequency vibrations, the kind produced by Bear Ridge mountain winds. Each joint took twice as long as nailing, but in return, the frame produced no cracking or violent shaking when the wind shifted. For the roof, Eleanor chose a pitch of 47, 52 degrees, a number not chosen at random. It was the optimal angle for snow to slide off without manual clearing, reducing the dangerous buildup of snow load like in many cabins she had seen down in town. That pitch also minimized direct wind force on the surface, forcing the wind to glide over rather than pound against it. A flat roof would accumulate snow. Too steep a roof would catch gusts and lift. Eleanor chose the middle ground, exactly as her husband's notes and her own scale models with rulers and paper had shown. But what began to silence distant observers wasn't the roof or frame, it was the shallow north windbreak trench Eleanor dug into the ground behind the cabin. It wasn't for shelter, but to create a low-pressure zone that slowed the wind before it hit the main load-bearing wall. Simply put, instead of letting the wind slam straight into the wall, she made it drop into a pocket of decelerating air, weakening its energy before impact. No one in town had ever seen that done. It was a method some U.S. military outposts had used in Alaska in the 1,940 seconds, but few civilians knew of it. Finally, the hot and cold air circulation system. Eleanor designed the cabin so cold air was forced down to the floor, where she dug a trench leading outside while warm air from the stove stayed in the living area. It wasn't complex, but it was a practical application of convection. Hot air rises, cold air sinks. Many failed cabins didn't lack fire. They lost it in the wrong direction. Eleanor made sure that didn't happen. When townsfolk from Hawkstone hiked up to check progress, they no longer laughed as much. Norman Pike quietly watched her fit joints without a millimeter of error. Earl Mason touched the stone foundation and recognized solidity far beyond an amateur's work. Walter Briggs, who had criticized her repeatedly, stood silently for a long time before the newly raised roof, mentally calculating snowfall angles. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. She wasn't building a cabin to defy nature. She was building it by understanding it. And every stone slab, every joint, every roof angle proved that the woman they had seen as a certain failure was actually the one with the soundest technique on that mountain. Once the cabin frame was complete, Eleanor moved into the load testing phase, not with professional equipment, but with crude methods grounded in the structural physics principles she had taught herself over years. She hung sandbags from the beams, gradually increasing weight to simulate expected Bear Ridge crosswinds, then observed vibration and twist in the frame. If a beam vibrated beyond allowable amplitude, she readjusted the joint. If it vibrated evenly without separating connections, she marked the frame as sound. That patience meant the cabin, when facing real winds later, produced almost no warning sounds because every weak point had been tested beforehand with simulated loads. When the first snow fell, Eleanor continued testing her 47-52 degrees roof pitch. As soon as 2-3 inches accumulated, she tapped the edge lightly with a pole. The snow slid off exactly as calculated, without lingering or creating dangerous snow load. The even slide proved both the optimal pitch and uniform load-bearing structure. No sagging spots, no abnormal accumulation zones. This differed sharply from common regional cabins, many roofs warped or temporarily reinforced, causing uneven sliding and collapse risk. When word reached Hawkstone that snow had slid off the widow's roof without any deformation, attitudes began to shift. Norman Pike, who had laughed the loudest, whispered outside his lumberyard, "Her wall layout. It's like the military shelters from the 1,940 seconds, the Civilian Conservation Corps kind." Others started asking why her cabin looked so technically correct despite being built by a middle-aged woman with no formal carpentry background. But the most convincing proof wasn't external, it was internal. When outside temperatures dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, Eleanor lit the stove for an hour, then sealed temporary vents to see how the cabin responded. Interior temperature held steady at 48-52 degrees Fahrenheit for hours, no overheating, no drastic drop. This happened thanks to two principles she applied precisely: thermal mass from the stone foundation absorbing heat and releasing it gradually, and the closed convection system keeping warm air in the living zone instead of escaping through leaks. Inside, Eleanor felt warmth not flare up and die like temporary fires, but radiate evenly from the stone surfaces, spreading through the higher air mass to create a stable, warm zone. That was the difference between enduring winter and being swallowed by it. She recorded every temperature reading, every small cabin change, every minute of vibration under test wind pressure. All confirmed that what she had built wasn't just shelter, it was the result of thinking that adapted to natural physics rather than fighting it. And as the numbers, vibrations, snow slides, and heat retention proved themselves, Hawkstone, for the first time, stopped laughing at her. They began to see the cabin on Bear Ridge as something worth learning from. News of the storm began reaching Hawkstone one October afternoon when the Montana Weather Service issued a red alert. An Arctic surge system was forming north of Alberta, carrying a mass of extreme cold air down the mountain paths and meeting moist flow from the Pacific. The perfect conditions for a Category 5 blizzard, the kind meteorologists called a combination that shouldn't happen but occasionally does to remind people how small they are. The warning was severe enough to silence even the longest residents. Wind chill could drop to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to paralyze the body in minutes. Predicted whiteout conditions lasting 72 to 96 hours, making it impossible to tell sky from ground, rendering direction meaningless. For Hawkstone folk, accustomed to harsh winters, just hearing Arctic surge was enough. This wasn't a storm, it was a survival test. And when models confirmed it would sweep straight across Bear Ridge, the whole town knew the widow up on the slope was certainly in danger. While down in town, people boarded windows, erected barriers, checked generators. Eleanor on the mountain began her cabin checklist, the technical protocol she had developed throughout construction. She reinforced roof supports with additional cross-bracing to reduce twisting risk under wind pressure. She inspected all vent gaps, sealing unnecessary ones to prevent negative pressure, sucking warm air out. She created a heat core zone, the central area with stove, stored stones, and backup heat to maintain a stable, warm pocket when cold attacked from multiple sides. Eleanor wasn't blindly optimistic. She knew her cabin was built with careful technique, but she also knew a Category 5 blizzard didn't care how well you prepared. It only cared whether you had a flaw, and a flaw of even an inch could kill. As she stood before the cabin at day's end, with the wind shifting and the air carrying the metallic cold smell of approaching snowstorm, Eleanor didn't tell herself she would definitely survive. She only said one quiet sentence, but it was absolute truth. If this cabin fails, it means I failed. And if I fail, I die. The blizzard arrived exactly as forecasted, even more ruthless. On the first day, winds hit 60 miles per hour, creating lateral pressure 4 times greater than normal Montana winter winds. For many regional cabins, this was the threshold where wooden walls separated at joints or roofs lifted off beams. But Eleanor's cabin held thanks to 2 factors she had planned for: the stone foundation absorbing wind force and lowering the center of gravity, while double load-bearing axes running lengthwise dispersed horizontal vibration, preventing pressure buildup at single points. Gusts strong enough to make Ash shudder and press against her legs caused the cabin to vibrate only within small amplitude, like a box designed to flex rather than break. By the second day, heavy snow began falling and quickly accumulated. In just 6 hours, snow load on the roof reached 35–40 pounds per square foot, enough to collapse rows of old-style cabins lacking proper pitch. Snow, driven by wind from the ridge, piled against the cabin, rising window-high like a white wall. But Eleanor's 47–52 degrees pitch worked perfectly. Snow couldn't hold its weight on the surface, and continuously slid off exactly as she predicted. The real danger came when wind shifted, creating negative pressure behind the cabin that sucked air down the chimney and forced stove smoke inside a technical failure that could suffocate occupants. Eleanor recognized the issue in minutes by watching smoke direction. She immediately propped a thick board as a temporary deflector, rerouting interior airflow to balance pressure. When wind shifted again, smoke resumed proper flow, and the stove continued working. The third day was the final test. Winds along the ridge turned north, slamming directly into the windowless wall, the one Eleanor had reinforced from the start with deeper stone and wood joints. North wind pressure was always Bear Ridge's greatest threat, but thanks to the rear windbreak trench, most impact was dissipated before reaching the cabin. Each blow made the entire structure shudder as if tested by a giant hand, but no joint separated, no board bent. Eleanor stood inside, hand on the lightly vibrating wood wall, feeling every force through the framework. There was no panic in her eyes, only clear thought. Nothing in this cabin is random. Everything is for this moment. Winds kept howling, Snow surged past windows like waves, but the cabin didn't yield. Every technical principle she applied, from thermal mass, slope angle, windbreak pocket to load distribution, was performing its role exactly, as if the cabin were a living creature fighting to protect its owner. And as the third night ended, with Bear Ridge submerged in the heavy silence of the storm's eye, the truth was clear. The cabin didn't stand by luck. It stood because it was designed to stand. As the howling wind through the roof gaps began to settle, Eleanor heard another sound, very faint but unmistakable. 3 weak, intermittent knocks, as if the knocker was losing feeling in their hands. Ash sprang up, ears pricked, growling softly. Eleanor took the oil lamp, slowly unlatched the door to avoid a sudden gust, and when it cracked open, the storm nearly ripped the lamp from her hand. Before her stood 3 nearly frozen figures. Linda Rowe, face ashen. Jacob, the 8-year-old boy wrapped in a thin coat inadequate for warmth. And Walter Briggs, the man who had declared she knew nothing about the mountain. All 3 were in stage 2, hypothermia, violent shivering, slurred speech, waxy skin, eyes losing focus. Eleanor immediately pulled them inside, closing the door to prevent a sudden interior temperature drop. Without a second of panic, she followed survival manual protocol precisely. First, warm the core chest, abdomen, neck, rather than rubbing limbs, since direct heat to extremities would rush cold blood to the heart and cause arrhythmia. She wrapped Linda and Jacob in dry wool blankets, then placed stones warmed by the stove along their sides for safe heat increase. For Walter, nearly unable to control his muscles, she positioned him near the stove, but with a barrier to avoid rapid heating. As their breathing steadied, Eleanor gave them small sips of warm, not hot liquid to rehydrate slowly and prevent thermal shock. Jacob clung to Ash, breathing ragged but gradually evening out. Linda cried silently, seeing her son still alive. Walter, the town's most stubborn man, trembling, looked at the roof enduring the roaring wind outside, then at the woman he had mocked. It took nearly a minute before he could speak, voice broken but honest enough that even the storm couldn't swallow it. "I've lived here my whole life, and I don't understand the mountain like you do." The air inside the cabin wasn't much warmer than before the storm, but in that moment, with 3 people pulled back from the brink of death, it was the clearest proof that Eleanor's knowledge, technique, and calm hadn't just saved her, they had saved those who had misjudged her. The wind still raged outside as if trying to tear everything apart, but inside the cabin, for the first time since the storm began, hope took shape. While the storm still roared outside like an endless grinding machine, inside the cabin, Eleanor faced an even harsher enemy: resource limits. After checking the wood supply, she quickly calculated, in the habit of someone long familiar with Montana climate, remaining firewood would last only 2 days if burned normally. But the cabin now held not 1 person but 4 people and a dog, all needing steady heat to avoid slipping back into hypothermia. Eleanor mentally ran BTU outputs of a small fire against cabin volume and the air mass needing to stay above 45 degrees Fahrenheit for human function. The only conclusion: control the fire scientifically. No room for emotion. She established a heat rotation cycle, a strategy no one in town would think she had the knowledge to devise. Phase 1. 90 minutes of heating, burning hotter than usual to reach a safe baseline temperature. Phase 2. 120 minutes of maintenance, cutting wood to half to keep temperature from dropping below danger. Phase 3. Extinguish fire for 45 minutes, a seemingly risky move, but based on Eleanor's understanding of material heat storage. During that no-fire period, the cabin didn't cool too quickly because she had turned the foundation stones into a thermal battery. When the stove was hot, stones absorbed heat. When fire was out, they released enough to keep the cabin alive. This technique usually appeared only in thermal mass literature, but Eleanor, thanks to years rereading her husband's technical books, applied it perfectly in crisis. Next, she handled cold air seeping through walls. In many other cabins, wind whistling through wood gaps destroyed heat retention. But Eleanor used snow, the supposed enemy, as an ally. She packed snow into low wind gaps, creating snowpack. Few realized packed snow's internal air pockets made it a natural insulator better than thin wood. Result: the cabin became tighter, more stable, and required fewer BTUs per hour. Throughout the heat-maintain-extinguish cycles, Eleanor listened to the cabin like listening to a living creature's breath. She felt gentle warmth spreading from the stone blocks, watched window condensation to estimate heat loss, adjusted wood amounts by data rather than feeling. Linda watched her, almost unable to believe a woman they had seen as too old to build a cabin could calculate so precisely amid a blizzard. And Jacob, the boy's small body gradually recovering. Skin tone shifted from gray to pink. Breathing steadied. Each time the cabin entered the 45-minute no-fire phase, he still felt warmth from floor stones and packed snow at the base, turning the cabin into a slow-draining heat nest. Walter Briggs, the man who had spent a lifetime claiming to understand mountains, storms, Wood sat watching the fire in maintenance phase. He recognized every principle she was using, and recognized further that if this cabin had been built by any man in town, they likely would have burned all wood in one day from panic, or opened the door too many times to check conditions and let cold kill everyone. He slowly removed his glasses, wiped his eyes. Without hiding or shame, he let tears fall onto the stone floor that had saved them. "I mocked you," he rasped, "and this cabin, the very things I laughed at, are keeping us alive." Eleanor didn't reply. She just continued monitoring ember levels, repositioning a heat-storing stone by the stove, because in the cabin right then, emotion wasn't priority, survival was. But though unspoken, her slight nod acknowledged. It wasn't strength keeping them alive. It was understanding, not luck, but technique. And on a night when death was only a few degrees Fahrenheit away, Eleanor's clarity and science became the last spark of hope. When the storm finally retreated, not dissipating but as if exhausted after 3 days and nights battering Bear Ridge, the first silence over the cabin felt almost unreal. Winds dropped from 70 miles per hour to 10 miles per hour, as if someone had turned off a giant machine. Eleanor opened the door after rechecking interior pressure to avoid thermal shock, and the sight made both Walter and Linda freeze. Snow buried nearly to the roof, forming white walls taller than the cabin, but the structure remained intact. No warped boards, no displaced stones, no signs of structural fatigue, nearly impossible after a Category 5 blizzard. The Hawkstone rescue team arrived that afternoon on snowshoes, stopped in their tracks upon seeing the cabin, silent for seconds in disbelief. 2 nearby cabins on Bear Ridge had lost roofs, one even half its north wall to wind vortex. But Eleanor's cabin stood straight, as if the storm had been merely a test it had prepared for years in advance. When the local engineer Martin Kepler, who had worked for the Forest Service, examined it overall, he walked around the stone walls, stood before the pitched roof, tested wood resilience and joint integrity by hand. After minutes, he said a sentence that silenced the entire rescue team. "This cabin handles load and lateral force dispersal on par with 1,952nd CCC shelters, and even sheds snow better." For Montanans, that wasn't ordinary praise. CCC shelters were considered the gold standard for mountain survival structures built never to collapse in major blizzards. Hearing that, Walter turned to look at Eleanor as if seeing anew the person who had saved them for the first time without prejudice. News of the cabin surviving the storm reached Hawkstone faster than the rescue vehicles. When Eleanor returned to town with Linda, Jacob, and Walter, people no longer saw her as the reckless widow who built a cabin alone on the mountain. Mocking glances turned to curiosity, then respect. Norman Pike, the lumberyard owner who had insisted Eleanor knew nothing about crosswind loads, touched the cabin wall during inspection and said only, "I was wrong." Earl Mason, who saw snow load as the end for any self-built cabin, stood looking at Eleanor's 50 degrees pitch, watching snow slide off effortlessly, and nodded in quiet acknowledgement. But the biggest change came from the community. They didn't just stop mocking, they wanted to learn. They asked Eleanor why she chose mortise and tenon over nails, why stone foundation instead of wood, why she dug a north windbreak and kept the roof between 47-52 degrees rather than steeper or flatter. And in that moment, Hawkstone understood that Eleanor hadn't fought nature, she had read it, calculated it, and turned the cabin into an entity compatible with Montana's wind, snow, and terrain. The storm passed, but what truly broke apart was the town's prejudice. In their eyes, the 54-year-old woman they had seen as a certain failure had become living proof of what Montana quietly taught its people. Strength doesn't come only from muscle. It comes from understanding, perseverance, and the ability to see order within chaos. And Bear Ridge, once considered land that devoured the reckless, now carried a different meaning. It was the place where a widow stood alone against a once-in-a-century blizzard, and won. As the snow gradually melted on Bear Ridge and the roads were reopened one by one, the story of Eleanor's cabin was no longer just about luckily surviving a once-in-a-century storm. It became the catalyst for a shift in mindset across the entire Hawkstone community. What had once been seen as a joke, a widow building a cabin on the windy peak, now turned into the new standard for mountain survival. The spread began very naturally. Townsfolk hiked up to see the cabin, not to judge or nitpick like before, but to understand how it had stood firm. They observed how perfectly the pitched roof had shed snow, touched the foundation stones that remained dry and stable despite bearing tons of pressure, and especially noted how the cabin retained heat without consuming too much firewood, something no traditional wooden cabin in the area could do. Eleanor, unaccustomed to being the center of attention, reluctantly took on the role of technical guide, but she understood that knowledge only has value when shared. She started with the roof pitch. 47 to 52 degrees, she said. That's the angle where snow doesn't have time to accumulate. Too steep, and the wind rips the roof off. Too shallow, and snow load kills the whole house. People took notes as if attending a lecture at a research institute. Next came the stone foundation. Eleanor explained why she placed a thick stone layer at the ground contact zone, where temperature fluctuations cause constant expansion and contraction. She picked up a stone block, placed it next to a piece of wood, and demonstrated, frozen ground pushes material up that's frost heaving. Wood warps, stone doesn't. Stone pushes the force back down into the ground. A simple principle, but no one in town had ever thought that way before. Then the airflow system. She described the convection principle. Cold air sinks, hot air rises, and her cabin harnessed that rule instead of fighting it. A low channel directed cold air out, keeping the living area at stable temperature. No cabin holds 48-52 degrees F with a small stove unless it's designed to retain. Martin Kepler, the engineer who had assessed the cabin after the storm, spoke up during a group session. What she did isn't instinct, it's engineering. Surprisingly, Eleanor didn't deny it. I just relearned what my husband had written in his notebook, she replied. Building a cabin isn't hard. Understanding it is. Word of the cabin spread beyond Hawkstone even before the local paper covered it. A week later, the University of Montana called. They wanted to send a team of vernacular architecture students to the site to study the cabin as a living case study in optimizing raw materials under extreme climate conditions. When the students arrived, they measured every angle, inspected every wood grain, every stone, every window orientation for analysis. One of them, a senior, told Eleanor, if you'd been born during the CCC era, they probably would have hired you as a design team leader. Eleanor smiled, a rare but profound smile. Meanwhile, Hawkstone itself began changing in practical ways. Norman Pike started selling properly keyline-dried lumber instead of the soft, warp-prone kind he'd carried before. Young builders learned Eleanor's mortise and tenon joining method, abandoning steel nails to avoid wood separation in cold winds. A group of local farmers even built barn models using Eleanor's suggested windbreak pocket principle, reducing crosswind force by 30–40% in winter. The town didn't just learn, they adapted. They applied, and they saw results. The following winter, 3 new cabins built to the Eleanor pattern withstood minor storms without needing extra reinforcement. This led the community to give her design a more formal name, Wind-Resistant Pioneer Model. The name spread as fast as a storm blowing through Bear Ridge, but this time it was a wind of knowledge rather than destruction. By year's end, when the University of Montana published the report, Structural Efficiency of the Bear Ridge Cabin and Practical Applications in High Wind Environments, Eleanor Whitmore's name appeared in the community contribution acknowledgments. For her, it didn't change daily life, but for Hawkstone, it marked a pivotal moment. A widow once mocked by the entire town had become the person who redefined Montana's survival standards, and that ripple effect from ridicule to knowledge would travel farther than any storm could reach. Eleanor lived for many more decades after the once-in-a-century blizzard, and each passing year only further proved that the cabin on Bear Ridge wasn't a miracle, it was a structure calculated to endure. Montana winds shifted direction. Snow changed in density. Climate fluctuated over the decades. But the cabin remained as solid as the day she laid the first stone. People say stones have memory. If that's true, every stone in the cabin walls carried the memory of a widow's hands that refused to yield to the mountain. On the west slope, overlooking the cabin, lies Ash's grave, the dog that had followed Eleanor from the very first day surveying Bear Ridge. She buried him at the highest spot, where the wind carried the scent of snow and the late afternoon light fell most gently, as if Ash were still guarding the cabin. To many in Hawkstone, Ash's grave wasn't just a dog's resting place. It was a symbol of simple loyalty, of friendship between two creatures that survived through instinct and resolve. Linda and Jacob never left Eleanor's life after that storm night. They visited the cabin every season, then every month, and eventually moved up to Bear Ridge to live with her for many years. They didn't choose Eleanor, they were saved by her, and in that quiet gratitude, a family formed in a way no law or bloodline could define. Jacob, the boy who had shivered through the storm night, grew up with memories of the cabin like others remember their childhood home. He became a ranger, someone who understood the mountain not from maps but from every breath. As an adult, Jacob founded the Eleanor's Shelter Initiative, a series of free classes for mountain residents on building shelters, reading wind, recognizing snow shifts and cold air flows, the very things Eleanor had used to save them. "We don't fight the storm," Jacob said at the first opening session. "We learn its language just like Eleanor did." The program expanded to 3 neighboring counties. Many young rangers viewed Eleanor's cabin as a living laboratory for survival engineering, and Bear Ridge became a place schools brought students each year to illustrate the physics of wind, snow, and materials. Eleanor aged, but her spirit never weakened. By the time she reached 80, the cabin still retained heat so well that in winter she only needed to burn the stove half a day. Hawkstone folks joked that if Montana ever got another storm of the century, Bear Ridge would just sigh and sway a little. But time, whether gentle or harsh, always fulfills its duty. In 1997, Eleanor passed away in her sleep, inside the very cabin she had built with those once calloused hands. Linda and Jacob were the first to find her, lying peacefully as if she had just extinguished the fire for the night. News of Eleanor's death spread across Montana, not because she was famous, but because she embodied what Americans have always seen as the core of the frontier spirit: perseverance, ingenuity, self-reliance, and respect for nature's laws. After the funeral, Hawkstone unanimously proposed recognizing the cabin as Montana survival heritage. The approval process took nearly a year, during which experts examined every material, every roof angle, every wood joint. They concluded the cabin held not only historical but academic value, a rare example of vernacular architecture optimized for extreme environments. On the day it was officially recognized, a bronze plaque was placed on the porch. It bore just one sentence, but one that captured her entire philosophy. She didn't fight the mountain. She learned its rules and lived. To many, it was the story of a widow. To Hawkstone, it was the story of a life that changed an entire region. And to Bear Ridge, it was a reminder that nature favors no one but offers no despair to those who listen. In the years that followed, when visitors stood before the cabin, they often asked, "How did one woman alone build such a solid shelter?" The Hawkstone answer was always the same: not strength, not luck, understanding, and perseverance that even a storm couldn't uproot. And so, the legacy of Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of Bear Ridge, lives on, not in books, but in every new home, every survival class, every Montanan who understands that sometimes, to survive, you don't need to defeat nature, you just need to understand it. Thank you for following the story. If you found it meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more survival journeys ahead. See you in the next video.